Hello, everybody. My name's Jim, and this is my reading wrap up for December 2023. If I sound sick, that's because I am. I was struck by the big C over the Christmas holiday, and I am currently climbing my way out of it. But this isn't about that. This is about the books that I read in December. I read four from front to back. I finished one, DNF two, and I started one. So there's a lot to talk about. Let's start with the DNFs first. The Woods Are Waiting by Catherine Green was my first DNF in December, and it wasn't necessarily that it was a bad book. It was just that I personally could not follow it. I realized I was like 40% into the book and I didn't really know what was going on. But the basic premise is that there have been disappearances. Children have been disappearing in the woods in this small town. A man named Jasper was originally arrested, but it turns out that the disappearances are still happening. So either there is a copycat or there's something more sinister in the woods that is causing these children to go missing. The two main characters in this story are Cheyenne and Natalie, and one of the reasons why I DNF'd this book was that the two they sounded the same. I can't remember specific things that happened in either of their stories. I thought that this book was a debut originally. It's not the reason why I picked it up, but when I saw it, I noticed that this was the only book written by Catherine Green. But it turns out that Catherine Green is just a pen name for co-authors who usually write romances, and I do remember specifically a romance beat in this book that was kind of like, oh, that happened. There was one character who was going over how hot this one character was. I feel like it was the character who was visiting or coming back, and maybe she saw a long lost friend and she realized that he had a glow up. I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the reason why I was turned off to the book, but it is like the one thing that I remember about the plot that stood out to me other than the basic premise of this book. The Light Between Oceans by M.L. Stedman is another DNF for me. The premise of this book is that there's a couple, Isabel and Tom, who are living in a lighthouse. There's a boat that washes up on shore with a baby in it, as well as the baby's deceased father. Isabel and Tom decide to take the baby in because obviously it can't survive on its own, just out there on the sea. So they take it home, they take care of it. We have no idea where the mom is. We have no idea how that boat ended up washing on shore in the first place. This was the prologue. It filled me with anxiety. I wanted to continue with this story from that point. I thought that it would start from there, but I should have taken a hint that because it was a prologue, we weren't going to start there. It went immediately from that into Tom's military background, how he and Isabel met, how they fell in love, how they moved to the lighthouse, and their routines. So what started off as something that gripped me and pulled me in really quickly started to tumble. This is a temporary DNF for me. I do plan to go back to it at some point. I'm not sure if I'm gonna, because there are so many other books that have grabbed my interest and pulled me away. They've pushed to the front of the line that I'm not sure I'm ever going to pick this book up again. But it's disappointing. I wanted to read it. It was one of the books that I wanted to finish by 2023, among others, which I didn't even get to pick up. But this was one that I was able to pick up, and I just didn't get into it. So now on to the books that I did read in December, starting with Lotería by Cynthia Pelayo. This is a collection of horror short stories centered around the cards that make up the game Lotería. If you don't know what Lotería is, it is kind of like bingo, where you have these cards, you have these images, and you have a caller, they call out a card. If there's a match, you place a bean on the image on your playing card. And then once you have a specific pattern, there are multiple patterns that you can get, then you call out Lotería. and you win, and if you're gambling, you get to take the pot. I thought that this premise was super creative and also ambitious because some of the cards are very innocent. It's so much easier to write a horror story about a devil or a demon than it is to write about something like a melon, for example. That being said, some of the short stories were incredible, while some of the stories felt a bit forced. When I was going into this collection, I typically don't pick up short story collections because they're often written by multiple authors. And then you have some of those authors that carry the collection on their shoulders while other authors kind of fumble. I was hoping that this would be a bit more consistent because all of the short stories were written by the same author, but you did have that situation where some of the short stories just felt forced, and it could have just been the nature of the card that she was trying to write a story for. And just for the record, just so you know, that some of the cards, while they might have been mentioned in the story itself, they weren't necessarily the subject of the story. So that played a role in it too, where the card just provided inspiration but wasn't necessarily the focus of what was going on. There was another disconnect with how dark Cynthia Pelayo was willing to go with some of her short stories. There was one story, La Sirena, the mermaid, that she wrote. It was pretty early on. I think it was like chapter 6. That went super dark and was a bit too real. It was about human trafficking, where I was taken aback a little bit and said, okay, wow, she is willing to go there. I need to take caution moving forward because she might go there again. But at the end of the day, this ended up being a 3-star read for me. There by Tommy Orange is a book that I started in November and finished in December. This is the story of a number of Native Americans who either live in Oakland or are traveling to Oakland for the big Oakland powwow. You read these perspectives, you get an idea of their day-to-day, their struggles with alcoholism, identity. There are many perspectives that have very tragic narratives that are compelling but also make you really feel for the characters. I do think that in this book there were too many perspectives to follow. I really wish that I was able to grab onto 5. I did mention 5 specific points of view in my review for this. Specifically Orville, because he was a young teen who was discovering his heritage for the first time after it had been kind of hidden away from him. Jackie was a very interesting character, where she was a recovering alcoholic who is confronting some of her past relationships. Dean was a character who I feel was a self-insert of Tommy Orange, just based on things that I've heard Tommy Orange say. He wrote this book to dispel misconceptions about Native Americans and about Oakland in general, because there was a quote, and I can't remember who said the quote, so I'm just going to leave the name of the person who said it in the video. But the book was inspired by the quote, "There is no there there," which people have taken to imply that there is no culture in Oakland. There's nothing going on in Oakland. And Tommy Orange wanted to dispel that misconception that there's nothing happening in Oakland. There is no life there. There is no there there. And Dean, as a character, he is trying to gather Native American stories as a collection that he can present to other people and kind of dispel those misconceptions as well. And there are other characters too. I'm trying to think. Edwin was one that I connected to really well, just based on who he was and how he was described. And then Tony, of course, was one that stood out to me as well. I can't really go into too much of Tony's perspective, but I do feel like he was necessary to drive the plot. And there were so many instances where these different perspectives interconnected with each other. They stepped in and out of each of the other points of view that I appreciated, but also that kind of helps my argument, where I feel like focusing on just 5 people would have made this book a bit stronger instead of introducing us to new characters constantly that we have to remember, the things that they know and the things that they see. But I did end up giving this a 4-star rating. Also, I feel like this is one of those books where you really ought to read the prologue. I think the prologue was super powerful, and it's something that you need to read before reading the rest of the story. Book Lovers by Emily Henry. I said earlier on in 2023 that I was going to try an Emily Henry book, or I kind of hinted at it, and this was the one that stood out to me the most, so I decided just to read this one. But it's about this woman named Nora who is a literary agent. She receives a call to meet with an editor to work with him. The two of them kind of work together on this one client who has been a very loyal client to Nora. She and the editor butt heads with each other. They both have their own ideas, their own opinions, and they don't really get along. So after that rude introduction, Nora and her sister Libby decide to take a trip to Sunshine Falls, which is a fictional small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. Feel the small town vibe. Libby even has a list of things for them to do. And then, from there, everything unfolds. So this book, I'm not a romance reader. I've said that a million times. But I did focus on things like Nora and Libby's relationship, the small town vibe, which I think Emily Henry did an amazing job with. There was even a town hall scene that I thought was hilarious. Some of the one-liners that she used were great. Of course, the romantic side was kind of and it could be why I didn't really like the love interest too much, but I did like everything else, and I appreciated everything else. There were some moments where I felt that Emily Henry tried a bit too hard to be descriptive, and I was just reading it like, okay, rein it in, sis. You don't have to try so hard. But yeah, there were so many things that I appreciated. I love that Nora was career focused. She was opinionated. And she kind of broke this mold where women, in order for them to be likable, they have to behave a certain way. But she was a very powerful character that I felt that I could connect to. Great job there. Didn't really care for the love interest. I ended up giving this 4 stars. Yellowface by R.F. Kuang is a bit of a controversial one around BookTube, I think, because of why the book was written. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. I'm not going to sit here and say that I did not enjoy the heck out of this book. I thought it was messy. I thought it was entertaining. June is not a likable character at all, but weirdly, I felt bad for her at some points. Basically, the premise of this book is that June and Athena have basically spent their whole adult life together in each other's shadows. They went to school together. They took the same classes, they graduated together, and now that they are full-fledged authors, Athena is seeing just mountains of success while June is struggling, and June is having a hard time understanding why, since their paths were so similar, why she is so far behind and Athena has shot so far ahead. But Athena, I think, is pretty oblivious to this jealousy because she still treats June like a friend. And one night she invites June to her apartment to read a manuscript that is unpublished that she wants June's feedback for. She passed there in the apartment, and there is this manuscript that's sitting there that's unpublished that June read and thought that it was incredible. And she said, wow, it sure would be a shame if this went unpublished. Let me do this for her, but also let me put my name on it. So that's the launch pad for everything. And of course, June continues to dig her hole deeper and deeper into this mess. And the whole plot of the story is basically like, will she be able to dig herself out of this hole? June is a horrible person. There is a lot of conversation about her being white and her not being accepted because she's white, and how Athena has all this privilege because she is a person of color. She was essentially the walking embodiment of I'm not racist, but there is one thing that I do want to comment on that I think a lot of people know, but there was a lot of commentary on the publishing industry particularly around books being listed on the bestseller list and the merit behind that. If you don't know, books that end up on the bestseller list are there because the author is already popular or they are very good at marketing themselves. It doesn't necessarily mean that the book is good. So if you read a book that is on a bestseller list that you just hate, you hate the writing, you don't understand why it was there, that's not why it was there. And similarly, if a book is good and it's on the bestseller list and you're like, oh, now I know why it's a bestseller, that's also not why it's a bestseller. The author had the privilege and the means to put themselves there. So this whole idea that June suddenly became an overnight success just because her book was written well, it didn't make sense to me. That was something that I didn't connect with. So that felt a little misguided. But R.F. Kuang is a good writer. And again, I can't lie and say that I was not entertained by this book. I did end up giving it 4 stars. And finally, this is a weird one, but this is the highest rated book of the month. This is Snowball, A Christmas Story by Andre Gonzalez. This was my only 5-star read for December, and the reason was because it was a book that I just needed to read at the time. I needed it. I watched one of Michaela's videos from Michaela Reads where she listed her, it wasn't the top 10, but I think it was the 10 Christmas horror books, horror mystery thriller books that she read this year, and she ranked them from worst to best. This was one of the best. It stood out to me. I was expecting a little bit more Chucky, like Chucky vibes, but it wasn't at all. This book was actually very dark, which was surprising to me, even though Michaela actually mentioned in her review that it was. It was still a surprise, just because look at the cover. You don't expect this to be as dark as it actually turned out being. Basically, this is the story of a really creepy Elf on the Shelf doll that was bought at a thrift shop by the mom, Erin, in this story. The main character is Brandon, and he starts discovering that weird things are happening in the house. Picture frames are being broken, his car was tampered with, just a series of unfortunate events that continue and continue to escalate further until things just start going really, really wrong. There was one thing that bugged me about Brandon, but it wasn't enough to drop the star rating. I just chalked it up to being a character flaw, because in books like this, you do kind of need characters with character flaws. And I think that beyond this, Brandon was a great dad. He was a great dad. We are here for dads who dad. You know what I mean? Beyond that, though, he did have this self-centeredness about him where when all these bad things were happening, he was thinking, why is all of this happening to me, when it really wasn't just him that these things were happening to. He just had to kind of deal with the aftermath of all of it. And I think that short-sightedness, that narrow vision that he had where everything was just happening to him, prevented him from making certain decisions that he should have made in the book. And it could have been frustrating, but there wasn't really a point where I did feel frustrated with him. I did feel like it was a pretty glaring character flaw, and whenever he would bring this up, I would just kind of sigh and be like, Brandon, please open your eyes. The length that this book was perfect. It got straight to the point. I think Michaela even said that in her review, and it's something that I appreciated as well. There was no meandering. There was no taking its time. Everything happened. The pacing was great. Everything built up and escalated effectively. And there were so many points in this book that were absolutely shocking. I will say that you need to read content warnings for this book. There obviously is a lot of death, a lot of gore. There are certain things that involve animals. Just be careful going into this one if you want to read it. Again, I was expecting Chucky. I got something dark, but I still got a 5-star read out of it too. And finally, the book that I started in December, I haven't gotten too far in, but I am far enough into where I want to talk about some things. The Drift by C.J. Tudor. This is another recommendation by Michaela at Michaela Reads. So far, this is the story about 2 coaches, not people, but like vehicles that have derailed, have gone off track. They are supposed to go to a retreat and they didn't make their destination. There are 3 characters, Meg and Hannah, who are each on separate coaches that have gone off track, and then Carter, who works at the retreat. Right now, where I am in the book, we've basically just done roll calls for the cast. It's a pretty big cast. And Michaela did mention that in her review as well. But yeah, it is a bit character soupy. But one thing that's sticking out to me that I do not like right now is that we have 2 characters in the coaches. We have Meg and we have Hannah. And in each of their coaches, there is another woman. So Meg has Sarah and Hannah has Cassie. And the women are butting heads. Typically, this doesn't stick out to me so much because I know that not everybody's going to get along in a story. But when you have a lot of characters where most of the characters are men and you have 2 women in a confined space and they're not getting along, it's very obvious, especially if you duplicate that and you have that twice. That's bugging me a little bit. I hope that they become friends over time. There is a 3rd woman. There is another woman in Hannah's car, but right now she is bleeding out and I'm not sure if she's going to make it or not. And this isn't a spoiler. This is like first chapter stuff. But of the women who are of sound body and mind, they do not get along. And that bothers me a little bit. I'm going to continue reading this. Hopefully I can finish it in January and give you a proper wrap up next month. But if you were interested in any of these books that I mentioned today, the links to their Goodreads pages are in the description below. Click on those. Check out the retailer of your choice if you're feeling brave and purchase them, or head on over to your library or use your library app to borrow them if they are available. Leave a like, a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading and stay well.